Sally Jenkins at the Washington Post, had the story this weekend, and I'll let her explain it to you. But Jerry Jones is in a photograph at 14 years old in 1957 in the middle of a civil rights unrest. And I'll let Sally take the story from here because it was a part of a much broader story she was working on that's got a lot of nuance in it, but that's the part that got the most traction, Sally, because I don't even know where this story started. How is it? I know you are always holding owners to account. I know you have very good relationships. I don't know how this story came to be, and thank you for joining us, by the way.
Sure. First off, I partnered on the piece with the great David Marinis, the two-time Pulitzer winner for the Washington Post, who did Bill Clinton's biography several years ago. So it wasn't just my story. It's been a big team effort. The Blackout series by the Washington Post sports section is basically a 9-part series and an attempt to take a look at why there aren't more Black head coaches in the NFL, given that about 70% of the labor force is Black, which is, these guys spend their whole lives studying the game, and yet they're not proportionally represented among head coaches. There's only 3 Black head coaches in the entire league. So we set out to look at that from every angle and possible. And one angle is, of course, from the owner's point of view. Jerry Jones was the only owner of 32 requests that we sent out who actually agreed to sit down and talk to us about this, which we give him a lot of credit for. We wanted to do a piece on an owner that looked at, generationally, how they were shaped, what shapes their attitudes, how their attitudes might have changed over the years towards racial justice issues in the NFL. And of course, Jerry Jones had that very famous instance where he linked arms with his players and took a knee during the whole controversy over social justice protests in the NFL. So that was the genesis of the piece. It was part of a larger project. We came across this photograph of Jones. It's at the start of his school year at North Little Rock High School. He's 15 years old. He's on the cusp of his 15th birthday, and he's very clearly identifiable in the photo, which ran on the front page of the New York Times in 1957, because Little Rock was undergoing a real crisis over the desegregation of its schools, to the point that President Eisenhower had to send the 101st Airborne into Little Rock to quell the violence over Black school kids trying to go to white schools. So we knew that Jerry Jones had witnessed, or at least had lived through, a very tough civil rights era in Little Rock, and we wanted to talk to him about that, and we just started to research it for the purpose of asking him questions when we came across that photo.
If someone says to you Arkansas was racist in 1950s, you'd say yes, of course, because of all the history you cite that you cite there. So of course, somewhere that Jerry Jones would be descending from and around racism. The answer to that would be of course, right?
Right, and not just Little Rock, although Little Rock was a very critical sort of nexus point in the school segregation fight. It was a huge national story at the time. It was the biggest hotspot on the map for this subject. And so we knew from, as basic students of history, that Jones and his family surely lived through that era. What we didn't know when we started out was that Jones had been directly involved in an incident on schoolhouse steps. So then the question becomes, okay, so he was there. What does that mean? What does it mean to him? What does it mean for the story? And what should the emphasis on it be? And those were all very delicate questions that Marinis and I had to sort through in putting the piece together.
Sally, is it fair to judge a person by a photograph that was taken when they were a child?
Of course not. Certainly not. What is fair is to ask him about what he witnessed, ask him what he experienced, ask him how his views may have changed, if they did change at all. How has he evolved on issues of social justice and racial justice? And the fact is that he has evolved. Particularly recently. He started out as a real hardliner on the whole Colin Kaepernick crisis in the NFL. At one point, Jerry Jones said that the Dallas Cowboys would stand for the anthem and, quote, toe the line. Well, he's really softened on that. He's become a much more considered voice on the subject, partly thanks to his conversations with his Black Vice President of Personnel, Will McClay. So those are the sorts of things that we wanted to talk to him about. And we're really glad that he agreed to sit down and talk about it all. He's not defensive on the subject, as he told us, and as he's told others. He feels very genuine in his own skin, and he tends to talk pretty forthrightly about these things. Now, his answers won't satisfy everybody. I mean, the mere fact that he was on the steps is a tough thing, because there were no real, purely innocent bystanders that day. It was a day that became very physical for the Black kids who were on those steps. You had to run to get to the top of the steps ahead of them. There was a huge mob assembled. They were spit on. They were called the N-word. They were shoved off the steps. Crosses were burned at the opening home football game of North Little Rock High School. Eventually, bombs went off in downtown Little Rock. A Black photographer named Alex Wilson was beaten half to death near Central High School in Maine, Little Rock. So, it's a very, very tough time. It was a huge national story, and Jones's presence there and his thoughts on the day and his thoughts on today are important to look at and to talk to NFL owners about.
Stugotz, I don't think I'm oversimplifying this, but Sally, please correct me if I am. You're talking about two very accredited journalists basically pouring time and investment into a story of telling, how do we do this politely? Hey, Jerry Jones, have you realized that you descend pretty clearly from racism, and that might infect your hiring practices or how you view the world as an 80-year-old billionaire, that you're coming to literally question a billionaire part of the power structure that is, granting you an audience because he doesn't mind abiding this pressure that none of these other guys want to answer to. This is why you took up this story, no, Sally?
Oh, completely. Yeah, we took up the story because Jerry Jones is the single most influential owner in the NFL. He's called the shadow commissioner. And as he agreed in conversation with us, if Jerry Jones wants to move the needle on race and the NFL, it will move. He acknowledges that he has an influence, and the Cowboys have an influence that no other team really has. They're such a powerful icon, and he's such a powerful owner that he can move the ball on this issue. And so that's one reason why he thought it was important to talk to us, I think. So yeah, that was the genesis of the story. That's the real meaning of the story. Of course, people shouldn't be held responsible for what they did at 15. And of course, people shouldn't be held responsible for what their fathers thought or what their grandfathers thought. Jones did not know that his grandfather was a member of the Capital Citizens Council, which was a very, very tough segregationist group that may have been behind some of the more violent things that happened in Little Rock. He did not know that. That was news to him. So, in some ways, we were telling him things that he'd never heard before. So of course, you don't hold people responsible for that. But what you do, particularly when they're someone like Jerry Jones, who has so much influence, is you ask them about their own experiences and their own thoughts and their own evolution on this subject, because we have to have the frank conversation. Otherwise, the coaches keep being met with this implacable silence and this real impasse on the subject. And so, the quest here is for understanding, right?
It's interesting, though, Sally, because you say the quest is for understanding, but if I'm not putting this too delicately when I say you've got two award-winning journalists going to ask Jerry Jones if he understands that he's racist, or that he's imprinted by it, that whether the photograph excuses him or whether it's fair to go back 65 years or not. Hey, do you realize that your history might infect the fact that you never hire a black dude in a position of power?
Right. I mean, it was a tough conversation. I mean, what can I say? We asked some very point blank questions. Probably the most point blank question of the day was, Jones fervently believes that you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and that, you have to really want one of these 32 jobs. They're almost impossible to get. He kept saying it's easier to get elected a senator than it is to get a head coaching job in the NFL. And that's probably true. And Jones's belief is that if you want it bad enough, you'll do some, as what he called, inordinate things to get there. You really have to strive. But the tough question of the day in our conversation with him, which lasted, about 2.5 hours, was, well, look, is it possible that these men are facing an obstacle that you're not acknowledging? Just as, 6 black school kids, they were highly aspirational too. Back in 1957, 6 kids want to walk up those steps and get in that school to get a better education. Is it possible that they faced, a real impasse and an obstacle they couldn't surmount? And so that question's relevant today. Are black men in the NFL facing problems that they themselves cannot surmount with pure effort?
Sally, thank you for the work and the reporting. Is there anything else that you feel the reader should be taking away from why it is that you reported this and what it is that you were doing here?
I think there's a lot of debate about whether there really is a problem in the NFL, and the answer is a declarative yes. This is not some murky proportional statistical wrinkle where you go, oh, should the percentage of black head coaches be higher given the overall representation of the population or something? Black men the rare black man who has become a head coach in the NFL waited an average of 9 years longer for his opportunity to become a head coach. That's one of the things our data showed. There is a problem. It is a hardcore, real problem. And it's going to take a guy like Jerry Jones to acknowledge that impasse and address it and realize that, no, you can't just pull yourself up by your bootstraps as a black man in the NFL. There's something more going on there that's getting in their way.
Who's going to own the Commanders?
I have no idea, quite frankly. I mean, I probably shouldn't say this, but I hope it's not Jeff Bezos. I hope he buys a team out west. I think it would be better for the paper if we just cover this team without that complication. But, so that's how I feel.
That's
I really
very
don't care who
selfish.
owns them.
That's very selfish, Sally. You don't want the conflict with the newspaper to come over his ownership
That's
of the
her
Commanders
boss too, right?
And it's her
geez.
boss.
Yeah,
It's also brave.
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather
Sally.
keep it clean. I'd rather him own some other team outside of town, but that's just me. But good luck to him. And the main issue is, it doesn't need to be Dan Snyder ever again. I mean, anyone will be better than this guy. I mean, it's just the league cannot survive another year with Dan Snyder as an NFL owner, and leave any shred of its reputation intact. This man should not be owning anything. He should not be in charge of anybody's life.
Sally, thank you for being on with us. Thanks for the work.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Sally.